Alright, welcome back. I just got to the beach. It's down there, but I'm just going to stay up here by the grass. I came here a long time ago for the other book while everyone was isolating. I won't say why, because I make my videos timeless. Anyway, alright, let's see what chapter we're on. We're returning to The Princess and the Goblin. It's from the 1800s. It's a George MacDonald book, and it's amazing. And there's high spiritual truths in it that can totally change your life. But you can just enter the story and be present with it. Let's see if I can get the sun. There. Chapter 16, XVI, Thematic. Remember his pickaxe. While the magistrate reinvigorated his selfishness with a greedy breakfast, Curdie found doing nothing in the dark rather wearisome work. Remember, he was in the prison. It was a useless attempting to think what he should do next, seeing the circumstances in which he was presently to find himself were altogether unknown to him. So he began to think about his father and mother and their little cottage home, high in the clear air of the open mountainside, and he thought instead of making his dungeon gloomier by the contrast. Oh, and the thought, okay, hold on, I was distracted a second. And the thought, instead of making his dungeon gloomier by the contrast, made a light in his soul that destroyed the power of darkness and captivity. But he was at length startled from his waking dream by a swell in the noise outside. Look at that noise outside that just happened. All the time, there had been a few of the more idle of the inhabitants about the door, but they had been rather quiet. Now, however, the sounds of feet and voices began to grow. All right. And grew so rapidly that it was plain a multitude was gathering. For the people of Gwentystorm always gave themselves an hour of pleasure after their second breakfast. And what greater pleasure could they have than to see a stranger abused by the officers of justice? The noise grew till it was almost, hold on. Oh. And there was my bookmark. Hopefully I'll get it. I bet. The noise grew till it was like the roaring of a sea, and that roaring went on a long time. I block kids sometimes. For the magistrate, being a great man, liked to know that he was waited for. It added to the enjoyment of his breakfast, and indeed enabled him to eat a little more after he had thought his powers exhausted. But at length, in the waves of the human noises, rose a bigger wave. And by the running and shouting and outcry, Curdie learned that the magistrate was approaching. Presently came the sound of the great rusty key in the lock, which yielded with groaning reluctance. The door was thrown back, the light rushed in, and with it came the voices of the city marshal calling upon Curdie by many legal epithets, opprobrious, to come forth and be tried for his life, inasmuch as he had raised a tumult in his majesty's city of Gwentystorm, troubled the hearts of the king's baker and barber, slain the faithful dogs of his majesty's well-beloved butchers. He was still reading, and Curdie was still seated in the brown twilight of the vault, not listening, but pondering with himself how this king, the city marshal talked of, could be the same with the majesty he had seen ride away on his grand white horse with the Princess Irene on a cushion before him in the last book that I read. the king was mighty and beautiful and wonderful and knew the great-great-grandmother Irene, you know. He just wondered. He's wondering about the king right now. So you can go listen to the whole of The Princess and the Goblin, because I read that 2 years ago. Anyway, I'm so glad we're reading this now. You can listen to this one first. It's not going to matter. And so he wondered, he pondered with himself how this king the city marshal talked of could be the same with the majesty he had seen ride away on his grand white horse with the Princess Irene on a cushion before him, when a scream of agonized terror arose on the farthest skirt of the crowd, and swifter than flood or flame the horror spread, shrieking. In a moment the air was filled with hideous howling, cries of unspeakable dismay, and the multitudinous noise of running feet. The next moment, in at the door of the vault, bounded Lena, her 2 green eyes flaming yellow as sunflowers, and seeming to light up the dungeon. Let's see the picture. Oh, I love the sunlight. Oh, I love that we're getting this at sunset. Her 2 green eyes flaming yellow as sunflowers and seeming to light up the dungeon. With one spring she threw herself at Curdie's feet and laid her head upon them, panting. Then came a rush of 2 or 3 soldiers, darkening the doorway, but it was only to lay hold of the key, pull the door to, and lock it, so that once more Curdie and Lena were prisoners together. For a few moments Lena lay panting hard. It is breathless work, leaping and roaring both. It says in the thing right here underneath Curdie, it says Lena disperses the crowd. There's Curdie. It is breathless work, leaping and roaring both at once, and that in a way to scatter thousands of people. Then she jumped up and began snuffing about all over the place, and Curdie saw what he had never seen before, 2 faint spots of light cast from her eyes upon the ground, one on each side of her snuffing nose. He got out his tinderbox, a miner is never without one, and lighted a precious bit of candle he carried in a division of it, just for a moment, for he must not waste it. The light revealed a vault without any window or other opening than the door. It was very old and much neglected. The mortar had vanished from between the stones, and it was half filled with a heap of all sorts of rubbish, beaten down in the middle, but looser at the sides. It sloped from the door to the foot of the opposite wall. Evidently, for a long time, the vault had been left open, and every sort of refuse thrown into it. A single minute served for the survey. So little was there to note. Meantime, down in the angle between the back wall and the base of the heap, Lena was scratching furiously with all 18 great strong claws of her mighty feet. "Aha!" said Curdie to himself, catching sight of her. "If only they will leave us long enough to ourselves." With that he ran to the door to see if there was any fastening on the inside. There was none. In all its long history it had never had one. But a few blows of the right sort, now from the one, now from the other end of his mattock, were as good as any bolts, for they so ruined the lock that no key could ever turn in it again. Those who heard them fancied he was trying to get out, and laughed spitefully. As soon as he had done, he extinguished his candle and went down to Lena. She had reached the hard rock which formed the floor of the dungeon, and was now clearing away the earth a little wider. Presently she looked up in his face and whined, as much as to say, "My paws are not hard enough to get any farther." "Then get out of my way, Lena," said Curdie, "and mind you keep your eyes shining, for fear I should hit you." Because he doesn't want to run into her, you know. So saying, he heaved his mattock and assailed with the hammer end of it the spot she had cleared. The rock was very hard, but when it did break, it broke in good-sized pieces. Now with the hammer, now with the pick, he worked till he was weary, then rested, and then set to again. He could not tell how the day went, as he had no light but the lamping of Lena's eyes. The darkness hampered him greatly, for he would not let Lena come close enough to give him all the light she could, lest he should strike her. So he had every now and then to feel with his hands to know how he was getting on and to discover in what direction to strike. The exact spot was a mere imagination. He was getting very tired and hungry and beginning to lose heart a little, when out of the ground, as if he had struck a spring of it, burst a dull, gleamy, lead-colored light, and the next moment he heard a hollow splash and echo. A piece of rock had fallen out of the floor and dropped into water beneath. Already Lena, who had been lying a few yards off all the time he worked, was on her feet and peering through the hole. Curdie got down on his hands and knees and looked. They were over what seemed a natural cave in the rock, to which apparently the river had access. For at a great distance below, a faint light was gleaming upon the water. If they could but reach it, they might get out, but even if it was deep enough, the height was very dangerous. The first thing, whatever might follow, was to make the hole larger. It was comparatively easy to break away the sides of it, and in the course of another hour he had it large enough to get through. And now he must reconnoiter. He took the rope they had tied him with, for Curdie's hindrances were always his furtherance. This is like life. And fastened one end of it by a slip knot round the handle of his pickaxe, then dropped the other end through, and laid the pickaxe so that, when he was through himself and hanging on to the edge, he could place it across the hole to support him on the rope. This done, he took the rope in his hands and began to descend, found himself in a narrow cleft widening into a cave. His rope was not very long. It would not do so much to lessen the force of his fall, he thought with himself, if he should have to drop into the water. But he was not more than a couple yards below the dungeon when he spied an opening on the opposite side of the cleft. It might be but a shallow hole, or it might lead them out. He dropped himself a little below its level, gave the rope a swing by pushing his feet against the side of the cleft, and so penduled himself into it. Then he laid a stone on the end of the rope, that it should not forsake him, called to Lena, whose yellow eyes were gleaming over the mattocks grating above, to watch there till he returned, and went cautiously in. It proved a passage, level for some distance, then sloping gently up. He advanced carefully, feeling his way as he went. At length he was stopped by a door, a small door, studded with iron. But the wood was in places so much decayed that some of the bolts had dropped out, and he felt sure of being able to open it. He returned, therefore, to fetch Lena and his mattock. Arrived at the cleft, his strong miner's arms bore him swiftly up the rope and through the hole into the dungeon. There he undid the rope from his mattock, and making Lena take the end of it in her teeth and get through the hole, he lowered her. It was all he could do. She was so heavy. When she came opposite the passage with a slight push of her tail, she shot herself into it. All right, I'm just checking. I'm loving this so much. I just want to stay here till I finish the story, but I have someone with me today in the car. All right. So she shot herself into it and let go of the rope, which Curdie drew up. Then he lighted his candle. I'll do it like that so we can see the water, the sun on the water. Then he lighted his candle and, searching in the rubbish, found a bit of iron to take the place of his pickaxe across the hole. Then he searched again in the rubbish and found half an old shutter, like a window shutter, I think. This he propped up, leaning a little over the hole with a bit of stick, and heaped against it, the back of it, a quantity of the loosened earth. Next he tied his mattock to the end of the rope, dropped it, and let it hang. Last he got through the hole himself and pulled away the propping stick, so that the shutter fell over the hole with a quantity of earth on top of it. A few motions of hand over hand, and he swung himself and his mattocks into the passage beside Lena. There he secured the end of the rope, and they went on together to the door. This is chapter 17, the wine cellar. He lighted his candle and examined it. Decayed and broken as it was strongly secured in its place by hinges on the one side and either lock or bolt, he could not tell which, on the other. A brief use of his pocket knife was enough to make room for his hand and arm to get through, and then he found a great iron bolt, but so rusty that he could not move it. Lena whimpered. He took his knife again, made the hole bigger, and stood back. In she shot, her small head and long neck, seized the bolt with her teeth and dragged it, grating and complaining, back. A push then opened the door. It was at the foot of a short flight of steps. They ascended, and at the top Curdie found himself in a space which from the echo to his stamp appeared of some size, though of what sort he could not at first tell, for his hands, feeling about, came upon nothing. Presently, however, they fell on a great thing. It was a wine cask. He was just setting out to explore the place by a thorough palpation when he heard steps coming down a stair. He stood still, not knowing whether the door would open an inch from his nose or 20 yards behind his back. It did neither. He heard the key turn in the lock, and a stream of light shot in, ruining the darkness, about 15 yards away on his right. A man carrying a candle in one hand and a large silver flagon in the other entered and came towards him. I'll show you. The light revealed a row of huge wine casks that stretched away into the darkness of the other end of the long vault. Curdie retreated into the recess of the stair, and peeping around the corner of it, watched him, thinking what he could do to prevent him from locking them in. He came on and on until Curdie feared he would pass the recess and see them. He was just preparing to rush out and master him before he should give alarm, not in the least knowing what he should do next, when, to his relief, the man stopped at the third cask from where he stood. He set down his light on the top of it, removed what seemed a large vent peg, and poured into the cask a quantity of something from the flagon. Then he turned to the next cask, drew some wine, rinsed the flagon, threw the wine away, and drew and rinsed and threw away again, then drew and drank, draining to the bottom. Last of all, he filled the flagon from the cask he had first visited, replaced then the vent peg, took up his candle, and turned towards the door. There's something wrong here, thought Curdie. Speak to him, Lena, he whispered. The sudden howl she gave made Curdie himself start and tremble for a moment. As to the man, he answered Lena's with another horrible howl, forced from him by the convulsive shudder of every muscle of his body, then reeled, gasping, to and fro, and dropped his candle. But just as Curdie expected to see him fall dead, he recovered himself and flew to the door, through which he darted, leaving it open behind him. The moment he ran, Curdie stepped out, picked up the candle still alight, and sped after him to the door, drew out the key, and then returned to the stair and waited. In a few minutes, he heard the sound of many feet and voices. Instantly he turned the tap of the cask from which the man had been drinking, set the candle beside it on the floor, went down the steps and out of the little door, followed by Lena, and closed it behind them. Through the hole in it he could see a light and hear all. He could see how the light of many candles filled the place, and could hear how some 24 feet ran hither and thither through the echoing cellar. He could hear the clash of iron, probably spits and pokers now and then, and at last heard how, finding nothing remarkable except the best wine running to waste, they all turned on the butler and accused him of having fooled them with a drunken dream. He did his best to defend himself, appealing to the evidence of their own senses, that he was as sober as they were. They replied that a fright was no less a fright, and that the cause was imaginary, and a dream no less a dream, that the fright had waked him from it. When he discovered and triumphantly adduced as corroboration that the key was gone from the door, they said it merely showed how drunk he had been, either that or how frightened, for he had certainly dropped it. In vain he protested that he had never taken it out of the lock, and that he never did when he went in, and certainly had not this time stopped to do so when he came out. They asked him why he had to go to the cellar at such a time of the day, and said it was because he had already drunk all the wine that was left from dinner. He said if he had dropped the key was to be found, and they must help him to find it. They told him they wouldn't move a peg for him. He declared with much language he would have them all turned out of the king's service. They said they would swear he was drunk. And so positive were they about it, that at last the butler himself began to think whether it was possible they could be in the right, for he knew that sometimes when he had been drunk he fancied things had taken place which he found afterwards could not have happened. Certain of his fellow servants, however, had all the time a doubt whether the cellar goblin had not appeared to him, or at least roared at him to protect the wine. In any case, nobody wanted to find the key for him. Nothing could please them better than that door of the wine cellar should never more be locked. By degrees the hubbub died away, and they departed, not even pulling to the door, for there was neither handle nor latch to it. As soon as they were gone, Curdie returned, knowing now that they were in the wine cellar of the palace, as indeed he had suspected. Finding a pool of wine in the hollow of the floor, Lena lapped it up eagerly. She had had no breakfast and was now very thirsty as well as hungry. Her master was in a similar plight, for he had but just begun to eat when the magistrate arrived with the soldiers. If only they were all in bed, he thought, he might find his way to the larder. For he said to himself that, as he was sent there by the young princess's great-great-grandmother to serve her or her father in some way, surely he must have a right to his food in the palace, without which he could do nothing. He would go at once and reconnoitre. So he crept up the stair that led from the cellar. At the top was a door opening on a long passage dimly lighted by a lamp. He told Lena to lie down upon the stair while he went on. At the end of the passage he found a door ajar, and peeping through, saw right into a great stone hall where a huge fire was blazing, and through which men in the king's livery were constantly coming and going. Some also in the same livery were lounging about the fire. He noted that their colors were the same with those he himself as the king's miner wore, but from what he had seen and heard of the habits of the place, he could not hope they would treat him the better for that. The one interesting thing at the moment, however, was the plentiful supper with which the table was spread. It was something at least to stand in sight of food, and he was unwilling to turn his back on the prospect so long as a share in it was not absolutely hopeless. Peeping thus, he soon made up his mind that if at any moment the hall should be empty, he would at that moment rush in and attempt to carry off a dish. That he might lose no time by indecision, he selected a large pie upon which to pounce instantaneously. But after he had watched for some minutes, it did not seem at all likely the chance would arrive before supper time. He was just about to turn away and rejoin Lena when he saw that there was not a person in the place. Curdie never made up his mind, and then hesitated. So he darted in, seized the pie, and bore it swiftly and noiselessly to the cellar stair. Chapter 18. The King's Kitchen. Back to the cellar, Curdie and Lena sped with their booty, where, seated on the steps, Curdie lighted his bit of candle for a moment. A very little bit it was now, but they did not waste much of it on examination of the pie, that they effected by a more summary process. Curdie thought it was the nicest food he had ever tasted, and between them they soon ate it up. Then Curdie would have thrown the dish along with the bones into the water, that there might be no traces of them, but he thought of his mother and hid it instead, and the very next minute they wanted it to draw some wine into. He was careful it should be from the cask of which he'd seen the butler drink. Then they sat down again upon the steps and waited until the house should be quiet, for he was there to do something, and if it did not come to him in the cellar, he must go to meet it in other places. Therefore, lest he should fall asleep, he set the end of the helve of his mattock on the ground and seated himself on the cross part, leaning against the wall, so that as long as he kept awake he should rest, but the moment he began to fall asleep he must fall awake instead. He quite expected some of the servants would visit the cellar again that night, but whether it was that they were afraid of each other or believed more of the butler's story than they had chosen to allow, not one of them appeared. When at length he thought he might venture, he shouldered his mattock and crept up the stair. Here, let me see if there's a picture. No, there's not, but oh, so cute. I'll just do this. Or I can turn it for a second. Alright, I'll turn it towards me and the palm tree. Look. Let's see if I'll go up.
What is this?
I love sitting against trees. Alright. When at length he thought he might venture, he shouldered his mattock and crept up the stair. The lamp was out in the passage, but he could not miss his way to the servants' hall. Trusting to Lena's quickness in concealing herself, he took her with him. When they reached the hall, they found it quite quiet and nearly dark. The last of the great fire was glowing red, but giving little light. Curdie stood and warmed himself for a few moments. Miner as he was, he had found the cellar cold to sit in, doing nothing, and standing thus, he thought of looking if there were any bits of candle about. There were many candlesticks on the supper table, but to his disappointment and indignation, their candles seemed to have been all left to burn out, and some of them, indeed, he found still hot in the neck. Presently, one after another, he came upon 7 men fast asleep, most of them upon tables, one in a chair, and one on the floor. They seemed, from their shape and color, to have eaten and drunk so much that they might be burned alive without waking. He grasped the hand of each in succession and found 2 ox hoofs, 3 pig hoofs, remember with his special ability, his hands, one concerning which he could not be sure whether it was the hoof of a donkey or a pony, and 1 dog's paw. A nice set of people to be about a king, thought Curdie to himself, and turned again to his candle hunt. He did at last find 2 or 3 little pieces and stowed them away in his pockets. They now left the hall by another door and entered a short passage which led them to the huge kitchen, vaulted and black with smoke. There, too, the fire was still burning, so that he was able to see a little of the state of things in this quarter also. The place was dirty and disorderly. In a recess, on a heap of brushwood, lay a kitchen maid with a table cover around her and a skillet in her hand. Evidently, she too had been drinking. In another corner lay a page, and Curdie noted how like his dress was to his own. In the cinders before the hearth were huddled 3 dogs and 5 cats, all fast asleep, while the rats were running about the floor. Curdie's heart ached to think of the lovely child princess living over such a sty, because he loved her and doesn't want her to be in. Anyway, the mine was a paradise to a place with such servants in it. Leaving the kitchen, he got into the region of the sculleries. There horrible smells were wandering about, the evil spirits that came forth with the darkness. He lighted a candle, but only to see ugly sights. Everywhere was filth and disorder. Mangy, turnspit dogs were lying about, and grey rats were gnawing at refuse in the sinks. It was like a hideous dream. He felt as if he should never get out of it, and longed for one glimpse of his mother's poor little kitchen, so clean and bright and airy. Turning from it at last, in miserable disgust, he almost ran back through the kitchen, re-entered the hall, and crossed it to another door. He almost ran back through the kitchen, re-entered the hall, and crossed it to another door. It opened upon a wider passage, leading to an arch, in a stately corridor, all its length lighted by lamps and niches. At the end of it was a large and beautiful hall with great pillars. There sat 3 men in the royal livery, fast asleep, each in a great armchair, with his feet on a huge footstool. They looked like fools, dreaming themselves kings, and Lena looked as if she longed to throttle them. At one side of the hall was the grand staircase, and they went up. Everything that now met Curdie's eyes was rich, not glorious like the splendors of the mountain cavern, but rich and soft, except where, now and then, some rough old rib of the ancient fortress came through, hard and discolored. Now some dark bare arch of stone, now some rugged and blackened pillar, now some huge beam, brown with the smoke and dust of centuries, looked like a thistle in the midst of daisies, or a rock in a smooth lawn. They wandered about a good while again and again, finding themselves where they had been before. Gradually, however, Curdie was gaining some idea of the place. By and by, Lena began to look frightened, and as they went on, Curdie saw that she looked more and more frightened. Now, by this time, he had come to understand that what made her look frightened was always the fear of frightening. You know, she didn't want to frighten other people. And he therefore concluded they must be drawing nigh to somebody, nearer to somebody, you know. At last, in a gorgeously painted gallery, he saw a curtain of crimson, and on the curtain a royal crown wrought in silks and stones. He felt sure this must be the king's chamber, and it was here he was wanted, or if it was not the place he was bound for, something would meet him and turn him aside, for he had come to think that so long as a man wants to do right, he may go where he can, he or she, you know, where he can go no farther, and then it is not the way. Oh, when he can go no farther, then it is not the way. Only, said his father, in assenting to the theory, he must really want to do right and not merely fancy he wants to do right. You know, he must truly want to do the right thing. He must want it with his heart and will and not with his rag of a tongue. That's what his father told him, you know. So he gently lifted the corner of the curtain, and there behind it was a half-open door. He entered, and the moment he was in, Lena stretched herself along the threshold between the curtain and the door. Chapter 19, The King's Chamber. We'll have to return to that because I told the person waiting that I'd only be 30 minutes. All right. I wish you so much love. I wish we could just stay here and keep reading forever until it's over and then read it again. I hope you enjoyed. Please share and subscribe and get notifications and just go to the videos on my channel that resonate with you and share this with other people because I don't do ads or anything. I want to grow my channel organically and I haven't figured out YouTube's algorithm. All right, so much love.